There are people who spend the entire day being pulled out of themselves. One message changes their mood. One look changes their inner atmosphere. One sharp reply ruins their morning. One delay unsettles their chest. One criticism, no matter how small, keeps echoing for hours. And when night comes, the exhaustion does not come only from what happened. It comes from the number of times you left your center to react to things that never deserved so much space inside you. Maybe you have already felt this in a quiet way, almost difficult to explain, as if peace existed, but was always being interrupted, as if one small detail were enough to pull you away from yourself. And this is exactly where change begins, because most people believe the problem is in the world, in difficult people, in chaotic days, in injustices, in pressure, in provocations. But Stoicism makes an uncomfortable and liberating revelation at the same time. It is not the world that decides the size of your disturbance. It is the way you relate to it. And when you truly understand that, something very important begins to happen inside you. You stop feeling like a hostage to everything. You stop living in automatic reflex. You'll learn to protect your peace without having to run away from life. So stay with me until the end, because these 7 Stoic lessons are not only meant to make you calmer, they are meant to give back to you a kind of inner sovereignty that many people lost without even noticing. And if at any point in this reflection you feel that this kind of content speaks to a deep part of your life, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and write in the comments the phrase, "I choose peace." Sometimes an inner decision needs to be named before it begins to gain strength. There is a very common mistake that emotionally exhausts people, and that mistake is imagining that maturity means reacting better. In reality, many times, maturity means reacting less. Not because you have become indifferent, not because you stop feeling, not because you turn cold, but because you finally understood that not everything deserves access to your nervous system, your time, your heart, and your mental energy. That is a detail few people notice. Emotional exhaustion rarely comes only from major events. It comes from the accumulation of small, unnecessary reactions. It is the comment you replay in your mind. It is the argument that keeps going inside your head after it is over. It is the fear of something that has not even happened yet. It is the need to correct every injustice, answer every provocation, explain every misunderstanding, control every possibility. And little by little, a person loses peace. Not because life became impossible, but because they started handing their stability over to everything that touches them. The Stoics understood this with impressive clarity. They were not seeking a life without problems. They were seeking a mind that would not be hijacked by every oscillation of the world. And that changes everything, because it takes you out of the position of victim of circumstances and places you in the position of guardian of your own inner life. The first lesson is simple to say, but difficult to live. Not everything deserves a response from you. It sounds obvious, but it is not. Because the ego loves the feeling of importance that arises when we feel compelled to answer everything, argue with everything, fix everything, take part in everything. There are people who live as if every comment were a call, every provocation were a summons, every mistake made by someone else were a personal problem. And without realizing it, they make themselves emotionally available to chaos. Imagine someone who enters every battle of the day. They respond with irritation to the impatient driver. They argue with a rude clerk. They get offended by their partner's tone of voice. They take someone's delay personally. They keep dwelling on a post they saw on social media. They try to prove their worth in a conversation that should not even exist. At the end of the day, that person says the world is exhausting. But maybe what is exhausting them is not the world. Maybe it is the inability to choose where to place their own energy. Seneca had a very lucid view of this. It is not that life is short. Many times, it is we who waste it. And one of the quietest ways to waste life is to give too much attention to what does not deserve it. Attention is lifetime. Attention is destiny. Attention is vital power. When you give too much attention to what wounds you superficially, you are left with too little attention for what could strengthen you deeply. Maybe you know someone like that. Or maybe, if you are honest, you recognize it in yourself. People who feel an inner urgency to react, as if silence were weakness, as if not answering meant losing, as if letting something pass were a form of humiliation. But here is a powerful reversal. Many times, answering is losing, because you lose peace, you lose clarity, you lose energy, you lose greatness. Not every provocation deserves an explanation. Not every act of rudeness deserves confrontation. Not every opinion deserves defense. Not every wrong interpretation needs to be corrected. There are battles that continue only because you enter them. There are fires that grow only because you bring oxygen to them. There are situations that die from lack of reaction, and that is not cowardice. That is discernment. The truly strong man or woman is not the one who wins every confrontation. It is the one who knows which confrontations are not worth their soul. Think of how much peace you have already given away trying to be understood by those who did not want to understand. Trying to be validated by those who had already chosen not to see your value. Trying to defend yourself from accusations that said more about the other person than about you. That drains life in an invisible way. Because the body may leave the scene, but the mind remains there, talking to ghosts, building arguments, imagining better responses, trying to save an image. And this is where many people get confused. They think what they are protecting is dignity, when in reality, they are protecting pride. Dignity does not need a spectacle. Dignity does not shout to be recognized. Dignity knows how to walk away. Dignity knows not to explain itself beyond what is necessary. Dignity knows how to preserve silence when insisting would already be an inner lowering of oneself. So, the first practice to stop reacting to everything is this. Before you respond, ask yourself whether that deserves the price of your peace. Not the price of your opinion, not the price of your being right, the price of your peace. That question changes everything, because suddenly, you begin to see that many conflicts do not deserve your inner presence. The second lesson is even deeper. What disturbs you is not always the fact itself, but the meaning you give to it. This is one of the central keys of Stoicism, and when it truly enters your awareness, your whole life begins to be reinterpreted. A person takes a long time to reply to you. What happened? Objectively. Only this. They took a long time to reply, but within seconds, the mind builds narratives. They are ignoring me. I did something wrong. I am not important. People always pull away. Do you see the leap? The fact was small. The interpretation was enormous, and the emotional reaction was born more from the interpretation than from the event itself. That applies to almost everything. A colder look, an invitation that never came, a plan that failed, a criticism you received, a dry comment, a change in behavior. Suffering grows when the mind turns the fact into a total judgment about itself, about the other person, and about the future. Marcus Aurelius repeated to himself the need to see things as they are, stripped of the mental ornament that dramatizes them. Because when you look at an event without adding automatic emotional layers to it, it almost always becomes more manageable. Maybe there is a decisive detail here that few people notice. Reacting too much is often believing too much in the mind's first interpretations. And the hurried mind is not wise. The wounded mind is not fair. The tired mind exaggerates. The insecure mind personalizes everything. The anxious mind predicts catastrophes. The proud mind turns any discomfort into a threat. That is why it is not enough just to feel. You must investigate what is being told beneath the feeling. When something touches you, the question is not only, what am I feeling? The more mature question is, what story is my mind telling about this? Maybe you will realize that you feel rejected not because there was real rejection, but because an old pattern was activated. Maybe you will discover that you became furious, not because there was a serious attack, but because your desire for control was frustrated. Maybe you will notice that a small external failure opened a large internal wound, and that changes the way you relate to your own reactions. Because instead of immediately obeying them, you begin to understand them. Stoicism does not teach repression. It teaches conscious interpretation. That is very different. Repression is pushing things down. It is pretending you do not feel. It is hardening on the outside while becoming disordered on the inside. Conscious interpretation, on the other hand, is looking at the event and saying, I am not obligated to accept the first version my mind produced. That brings a silent but immense freedom. Imagine how much of your peace has already been stolen by assumptions, by rushed conclusions, by emotional readings made in the heat of the moment. How much unnecessary pain was born, not from what happened, but from what you concluded. And here is the beauty of this second lesson. If interpretation expands, disturbance, interpretation can also give peace back to you. Instead of thinking, they are against me, maybe it is simply, people have hard days too. Instead of concluding, I failed again, maybe it is, I made a mistake, and that does not define who I am. Instead of living in, I lost control of everything, maybe it is, not everything is under my control. And that has always been true. Notice how the soul breathes differently when the mind stops setting fire to what happened. The third lesson is the training of the interval. Between impulse and response, there is a small space. And it is inside that space that freedom begins. The problem is that most people do not live in that space. They live glued to impulse. They feel and they react immediately. The body tenses, and the tongue follows. The heart races, and the decision comes out unfiltered. The emotion rises, and behavior obeys. Then comes regret. Then comes shame. Then comes the attempt to fix what was said. What was, then what was ruined in 1 second. But Stoicism is, to a great extent, the art of lengthening that interval. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because you stop being a slave to the first internal discharge. Epictetus taught that we are not disturbed by things themselves, but by the judgments we make about them. But there is a practical implication in that which many people ignore. In order to examine the judgment, you first need to interrupt the rush to react. Without pause, there is no awareness. Without awareness, there is no choice. Without choice, you live on autopilot. Maybe you think that sounds beautiful, but too difficult in everyday life. And that is true. No one installs that. Pause overnight. It is trained. And that is the point that separates those who admire wisdom from those who truly practice it. The practice begins in the body. Because when emotion rises, the body knows before the mind does. The jaw tightens, the chest heats up, the breath shortens, the shoulders rise, the tone of voice changes, the impulse wants to come out. If you learn to notice these signals, you will already have gained an immense advantage. Because noticing the beginning of the storm is different from already being swept away by it. A person who wants to stop reacting to everything needs to create simple rituals of slowing down. 3 breaths before replying, a glass of water before arguing, 10 minutes before sending the message born from anger, a short walk before deciding, the silence of one night before giving the final answer. It may seem like little, but they are small gestures that preserve great destinies. There is an almost invisible strength in the one who can wait a little before acting. It is not passivity, it is inner government. And that inner government must be built like someone training a muscle that has been weak for years. At first, the person still reacts too much. They still notice it too late. They still repeat old patterns. But little by little, something changes. They begin to observe themselves earlier. They begin to recognize the trigger before the explosion. They begin to realize that what seemed impossible to hold back was, in reality, a habit of impulsiveness reinforced by repetition. And here, there's a profound turning point. Many people say, "I am like this," when they should say, "I got used to functioning like this." One phrase imprisons, the other allows change. You were not born condemned to be a hostage to your own temperament. You can train the timing of your response. You can become less reactive. You can learn not to hand your behavior over to any discomfort that appears. And that transforms not only your peace, but also your relationships. Because much emotional destruction does not come from malice. It comes from the inability to endure a few seconds of discomfort without acting against oneself and against others. The 4th lesson touches a very common pain. Stop personalizing other people's behavior. This may be one of the greatest sources of invisible suffering in adult life. Someone is distant, and you think it is because of you. Someone speaks in a dry way, and you already feel diminished. Someone changes their mood, and you assume you did something wrong. Someone does not acknowledge your effort, and you turn that into a verdict on your value. It is impressive how the human being, when emotionally vulnerable, tends to place themselves at the center of everything happening around them. But the truth is that much of other people's behavior says more about their inner world than about you. The rude person may be exhausted. The absent person may be confused. The critical person may be full of conflict within themselves. The cold person may have learned to survive by closing off. The aggressive person may be at war inside. That does not justify everything. It does not mean tolerating abuse. It does not mean accepting disrespect. It simply means understanding something liberating. Not everything is personal. When you stop personalizing everything, an enormous weight leaves your shoulders because you stop living with a constant question of what you did wrong, what you should have said, how you could have been better, why the other person acted that way. You understand that the other person is not a perfect mirror of your value. The other person is someone crossed by their own history, their own fears, their own lack of awareness. And that calms the heart. Not because you stop noticing what hurts, but because you stop turning every behavior of another person into a diagnosis about yourself. There are people who spend their whole lives trying to deserve gentleness from those who do not know how to offer it, trying to awaken clarity in those who live in confusion, trying to harvest maturity from those who still act on impulse, trying to find reciprocity in those who know only utility. And the result is devastating. They feel constantly insufficient. But maybe the truth is much simpler and much harder. Maybe you are not receiving little because you are worth little. Maybe you are expecting too much from someone who has little to offer at that level of awareness. Marcus Aurelius observed human nature realistically. He knew that people make mistakes, act badly, project their conflicts, and lose themselves in disordered passions. The point was not to become bitter because of that, but not to be naively surprised all the time. That is one way to protect peace when you understand that the world is inhabited by imperfect, wounded, vain, confused, and often unconscious people. You suffer less because of their behavior, not because you became cynical, but because you became lucid. And lucidity is an immense protection. It keeps you from begging for coherence where there is disorder. It keeps you from expecting depth where there is only superficiality. It keeps you from breaking yourself trying to turn the other person into what they have not yet chosen to be. Sometimes the greatest gesture of peace is not to convince, correct, or insist. It is simply to see clearly and adjust the distance. That is a decisive detail. Not every distancing is rejection. Many times, it is emotional intelligence. The fifth lesson may bother some people because it dismantles a very common fantasy. Peace is not only an inner state. Peace also requires boundaries. Many people speak of serenity as if it were enough to think differently, but it is not. There are environments that make people sick. There are relationships that drain. There are dynamics that disorder the soul. There are people who live invading, pressuring, manipulating, demanding, disrespecting, provoking, testing, and wanting to remain at peace without learning to set boundaries is like wanting to keep a house clean with the door open for anyone to walk in with muddy shoes. Inner peace is not only meditation, reflection, and self-awareness. It is also border. It is also discernment. It is also knowing how to say no without excessive guilt. This is where many good people lose themselves. They confuse kindness with total availability. They confuse love with self-abandonment. They confuse patience with staying in places that repeatedly wound them. And then they wonder why they are always exhausted. Stoicism does not teach emotional submission. It teaches responsibility for oneself. If something depends on you, then it also depends on you to protect the territory of your mind. That means that sometimes you will need to be misunderstood in order to remain at peace. You will need to disappoint expectations in order not to betray yourself. You will need to leave conversations that have already lost their dignity. You will need not to answer immediately, not to reply on the spot, not to explain yourself so much, not to accept certain tones, not to expose yourself to certain kinds of access. There are people who only respect a boundary when they feel the consequence of it, and here a very human fear arises. But what if they think I have changed? What if they think I have become cold? What if they call me difficult? The more important question is another one. How much of your peace will you keep giving away in order to maintain an image of pleasantness? Because there are people who sacrifice their emotional health in order to keep being seen as accessible, understanding, available, and nice. But a peace built at the cost of your own self-erasure is not peace. It is elegant exhaustion. The hardest boundaries are not always the big ones. Sometimes they are the small ones. Not arguing by text when the matter requires presence. Not answering calls at any hour. Not continuing a conversation when respect is ended. Not saying yes on impulse. Not offering yourself to solve everything. Not absorbing everyone's mood. Not opening your intimacy to those who have not yet shown the maturity to receive it. That completely changes the way life enters you. Because without boundaries, a person becomes a hallway with no doors. Everything passes through. Everything echoes. Everything invades. And then they call it sensitivity, when in reality, it is a lack of emotional protection. Being sensitive is not the problem. The problem is being sensitive without structure. The problem is having an open heart without filters. The problem is having compassion for others and no responsibility toward your own weariness. And here is an important reinterpretation. Saying no to certain dynamics is not closing the heart. It is preserving the ability to love without becoming ill. The sixth lesson is perhaps the best known in Stoicism, but also one of the least lived. You need to accept that there are things that do not depend on you. It sounds simple. Everyone has already heard this, but few have truly organized their lives around this principle. Suffering increases dramatically when you try to control what was never in your hands. The opinions of others, the timing of things, the past, recognition, other people's reactions, the exact result of your efforts, someone's love, the loyalty of the one who promised, the permanence of certain people, the absence of loss, the speed of healing, none of that is totally under your command. And yet many people live as if, with enough effort, they could control it all. That is where constant reactivity is born, because every time reality escapes expectation, the person becomes irritated, desperate, disorganized, resentful. It is not only the pain of the event itself, it is the pain of seeing the illusion of control shattered. Epictetus was almost surgically clear on this issue. Some things depend on us, others do not. And wisdom begins when you separate one from the other. Honestly, the problem is that the ego hates that separation. The ego wants to control what the other person feels. It wants to guarantee outcomes. It wants to prevent disappointment. It wants to manage impressions. It wants to anticipate the future. It wants to tame the unpredictable. But life does not negotiate at that level. Life will always have an untamable part. There will always be something outside the script. There will always be something slipping out of your hands. And fighting against this basic fact of existence is a permanent source of disturbance. Reactive people are often not merely temperamental. They are exhausted from trying to hold a world that cannot be held. They react because they cannot bear the limit of their own power. They react because they confuse acceptance with defeat. They react because they believe that if they loosen their grip a little, everything will collapse. But accepting what does not depend on you is not giving up on life. It is giving up on the wrong war. It is redirecting strength. Instead of trying to control the opinions of others, you work on your integrity. Instead of trying to guarantee that no one will disappoint you, you strengthen your discernment. Instead of trying to prevent every loss, you cultivate inner resources to go through them. Instead of demanding that the world be predictable, you become more stable inside. Do you see the difference? The energy does not disappear. It changes direction, and that change of direction is one of the greatest sources of peace that exists, because the heart begins to rest when it understands that its task is not to control all of life. Its task is to care for its own part with dignity, to do what is right, to act with clarity, to speak with truth, to decide with awareness, and then to release what does not belong to its domain. That does not reduce action. It purifies action. You keep doing what you can, but you stop going mad over what you never could control. Maybe you are living exactly this conflict in some area of your life, wanting to control someone's pace, the result of a process, the outcome of a relationship, the way you will be remembered, the reaction that will come after a difficult decision. And behind that attempt, there is almost always a deep fear. The fear of losing, the fear of not being enough, the fear of making mistakes, the fear of being treated unfairly, the fear of suffering. But the search for absolute control does not eliminate suffering. It only adds tension to what is inevitable. Life becomes too heavy when you want to hold in your hands what can only be crossed with maturity. And here is where a truer serenity is born. The serenity of the one who does the best they can and does not turn the rest into a mental prison. That person continues to feel, continues to care, continues to act, but does not break so much in the face of what escapes, because they have already understood something essential. Peace is not having guarantees about everything. Peace is being aligned with what depends on you, even when the rest is uncertain. The seventh lesson closes all the others, because without it, the previous ones become only good ideas. Your peace needs to be built before the crisis. This is a decisive point. Many people seek serenity only when chaos has already begun, only when the argument exploded, only when anxiety tightened, only when the pain became great, only when life went off the rails. And of course, in those moments, it is still possible to recover your center. But Stoicism teaches something deeper. The most solid peace is prepared in everyday life when nothing urgent is happening. It is in the ordinary silence of the days that you strengthen the mind so it will not be carried away by any wind. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not in ideal moments, but in the midst of the weight of empire, war, responsibility, and human fragility. He trained thought, he trained perspective, he trained a remembrance of what matters. Because he knew that if he waited for the storm to learn how to navigate, he would already be starting at a disadvantage. This applies to you as well. The person who wants to stop reacting to everything needs to create a habitual inner center. They need to have practices that bring them back to themselves. It may be a few minutes of silence upon waking before the world starts to invade. It may be a sincere prayer, a meditation, a brief reading, a journal where you write what you need to organize within yourself. It may be a walk without stimulation, simply to listen to yourself. It may be the habit of reviewing the day at night and asking, where did I lose myself today? Where did I keep my axis? What stole my energy unnecessarily? What can I do differently tomorrow? These questions seem small, but they re-educate awareness. They begin to produce a presence that did not exist before, and the person realizes they do not need to live only in reaction mode. They can live in observation, choice, intention. There is a very common misunderstanding about peace. Many people think peace is the absence of conflict. It is not. Peace is the ability to remain whole while conflict exists. Peace is not a life in which nothing frustrates you. Peace is not losing yourself every time something frustrates you. Peace is not external silence. Peace is inner order, and that order does not appear by accident. It is cultivated. There is one kind of soul that learns only through impact, and there is another kind that also learns through reflection. Stoicism invites you into this second path, a path in which the mind is not trained only by pain, but also by anticipated awareness. You begin to imagine how you want to act in the face of the inevitable. You begin to remind yourself, before the day begins, that you will encounter difficult people, misunderstandings, unforeseen events, irritations, delays, ingratitude, wrong interpretations. Not to become pessimistic, but not to be taken by surprise, as if the world had betrayed an agreement it never made. This preparation changes your reactivity a great deal, because much of disturbance is born from childish shock in the face of reality. How could this happen? How could they treat me like that? How could it go wrong? The prepared mind suffers, but it is not so scandalized. And here we arrive at something very beautiful. Protecting your peace is not closing yourself off from life. It is choosing the way you will remain in it. You do not need to become stone. You do not need to lose sensitivity. You do not need to turn into someone distant, cold, or emotionally uneasy. Genuine stoicism was never an invitation to dryness. It was an invitation to inner freedom. The difference is enormous. The inwardly free person feels, but is not dragged by everything, loves, but does not abandon themselves, cares, but does not dissolve, listens, but does not absorb everything, observes, but does not enter every turbulence. They understood that peace is not passivity. It is organized strength. It is gentleness with structure. It is presence without emotional servitude. And that, in a world that rewards excess, urgency, and instant reaction, becomes almost revolutionary. Maybe, listening to all this, you realize that for a long time you believed reacting was a sign of authenticity. I am real. I say what I think. I do not take disrespect home with me. I show what I feel. But maturity is not pouring out everything you feel in real time. That is often just romanticized impulsiveness. True authenticity is not in reacting to everything. It is in acting in a way that is consistent with your values. Even when emotion wants something else, the mature person is not the one who expresses every impulse. It is the one who chooses what deserves expression. It seems like a detail, but it changes families, marriages, friendships, work, environments, one's relationship with oneself. How many wounds could have been avoided if someone had breathed before speaking? How many connections could have been preserved if someone had distinguished pain from temporary truth? How many nights of peace could have been saved if a message had not been sent at the height of anger? There is wisdom in not immediately obeying what the heart feels in the heat of the moment. Another common confusion is imagining that someone who protects their peace has become complacent. But look carefully. There is an immense difference between an apathetic person and a peaceful one. The apathetic person gave up feeling. The peaceful person learned to select. The apathetic person disconnected. The peaceful person governs themselves. The apathetic person does not care. The peaceful person cares without destroying themselves. That is why, many times, those who still live in chaos misinterpret those who chose serenity. They call sobriety coldness. They call boundary distance. They call self-respect pride. They call refusing to enter useless arguments cowardice. And if you want to protect your peace, you will need to endure some wrong interpretations. That is also a price of maturity. You will not always be able to explain your change to those who benefited from your disorganization. You will not always be able to make everyone understand why you now respond less, expose yourself less, argue less, tolerate less, certain types of access. Some people feel your peace as rejection because they were used to accessing you without discernment. And here is an important truth. Not every discomfort another person feels in the face of your boundary is your fault. There is also a more intimate aspect of this journey. Stopping reacting to everything also means making peace with your own inner world. Because in many cases, excessive reaction is not born only from the present. It is born from an unprocessed past. One word touches something old. One silence awakens an old abandonment. One criticism activates an old shame. One delay rekindles an old feeling of not being important. And without noticing, you react to the now with the intensity of yesterday. That is why the path to peace is not only philosophical, it is also profoundly human. It requires that you observe yourself with compassion. It requires that you recognize your wounds without turning them into identity. It requires that you understand that some triggers are not moral weakness, but areas that still need care, awareness, and Stoicism, when properly understood, does not ignore this dimension. It offers structure so that you are not governed by it. It says, in essence, yes, pain exists, but pain does not need to decide your character. Maybe one of the most beautiful images to understand this is that of an inner house. For a long time, perhaps your house lived with its doors to open. Any noise came in. Any opinion echoed. Any rejection disordered the furniture. Any setback knocked something over inside. Now, these 7 lessons begin to give you architecture back. The first taught that not every noise deserves your opening. The second taught that many times the noise gains strength because of the meaning you add to it. The third taught you to create an entry hall between impact and response. The fourth showed that not every movement outside is about you. The fifth placed doors, keys, and boundaries. The sixth showed that you do not need to control the whole street in order to keep your house in order. And the seventh revealed that a strong house is not improvised in the storm. It is built beforehand. Do you see how everything begins to fit together? It is not about shielding yourself from life. It is about no longer being invaded by it every minute. And there is still something essential. Protecting your peace is not an event. It is a continuous practice. There will be days when you react better, other days when you notice it too late. There will be relapses. There will be old patterns trying to return. There will be situations that touch very sensitive points. Do not turn that into a reason to give up. Mature peace is not born from perfection. It is born from return. You lose yourself and come back. You react and learn. You fall into excess and recalibrate. That movement of return is sacred, because it shows that you no longer want to live as before. You've already seen too much to pretend you do not notice. You have already felt too much of the cost of reactivity to romanticize it. You have already understood too much of the value of serenity to trade it for any small dispute. And even if you still fail, something inside you now knows the way back. That is worth gold, because many people suffer without knowing why they suffer. You begin to suffer with awareness. And that is already the beginning of transformation. Maybe deep down, what you always wanted was not for the world finally to stop bothering you. Maybe what you always wanted was not to feel so vulnerable to every oscillation of the world. And that excessive vulnerability can be reduced, not through the illusion of control, not through escape, not through hardening, but through presence, discernment, and training. Training to let pass what does not need to enter. Training to question the automatic narrative. Training to breathe before acting. Training not to personalize everything. Training to establish boundaries. Training to release what does not depend on you. Training to cultivate, in the ordinary of the days, a center that is not so easily stolen. That is the path. It is not instant, but it is deeply liberating. When you begin to live this way, a silent transformation happens. Things continue to happen, but they no longer find in you the same flammable surface. The difficult person continues to exist, but you no longer offer yourself as a battlefield. The delay still comes, but it no longer tears away all your peace. Criticism may still hurt, but it does not define your identity. Another person's silence may still bother you, but it does not become a sentence on your value. The unexpected appears, but it does not destroy your dignity. Little by little, life stops seeming like a set of personal attacks and begins to reveal itself as it always was. A current of mixed events, some beautiful, others difficult, before which your true task is to remain conscious. And that brings a feeling that is very rare nowadays. The feeling of having returned to yourself. In the end, maybe the peace you seek is not as far away as it seems. Maybe it is not hidden in a radical life change, nor in the total absence of problems, nor in the ideal behavior of others. Maybe it is in the intimate decision not to give yourself away so easily anymore. Not to leave yourself because of anything. Not to allow every small agitation of the world to have the power to define your inner climate. That does not happen in a single day. But it can begin today. It can begin in this next conversation, in this next provocation, in this next uncomfortable silence. in this next delay, in this next impulse to answer in the same way. Maybe, for the first time, you will be able to perceive the space between emotion and choice. And maybe, in that space, you will find something you have been searching for a long time, your own inner authority. So remember this when the next trigger comes, because it will come. Someone will say something will slip out of your control. Another person's behavior will touch a wound. An expectation will be broken. A discomfort will ask for immediate reaction. And in that moment, instead of letting yourself be carried away as always, you will be able to ask, does this deserve my peace? What truly happened here? Without this story, my mind has already begun to invent. Do I need to respond now? Is this really about me? Where do I need a boundary? What here depends on me, and what does not? How do I strengthen my mind so this does not pull me away from myself? These questions are more than reflections. They are tools of freedom. They are exit doors for the one who grew tired of living emotionally captured by everything. And maybe that is exactly what Stoicism wants to give back to you. Not a life without noise, but a soul less available to noise. Not an existence without conflict, but a heart less enslaved by conflict. Not a cold personality, but a steady presence. Not a withdrawal from life, but a higher way of inhabiting it. Because deep down, protecting your peace is not hiding from the world. It is becoming inwardly large enough that the world does not reduce you at every moment. And when that happens, something very beautiful begins to bloom. You stop being a person who merely reacts to what comes. You become someone who chooses how to remain. And that choice, repeated in the silence of the days, is the beginning of a lighter, clearer, and far more truly yours life.